Well, hello and welcome back. My name is Guy Stevens. I'm the founder and executive director of the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint, and you are on the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint live podcast series. Really happy to have you here today. We've got a great show on board as always. For those of you that may not be familiar with our organization, the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint is really about how do we better support children, teachers, and staff in schools across the nation? How do we educate the public and connect people together that are dedicated to changing minds, laws, policies, and practices so that things like restraint seclusion can be reduced and eliminated from schools across the nation? As you probably know, it's not just restraint seclusion. We want to see restraint seclusion, suspension, expulsion, corporal punishment, all the things that are very often done to kids in the name of behavior. We want to look for better ways of supporting kids and staff so that we can move away from a lot of those punitive practices. Our vision, of course, is safer schools for students, teachers, and staff. So today, as always, always really excited about these programs. I hope you are as excited about them as I am. We have a lot of fantastic guests, and today is no exception. Really excited to have with us Heather Forbes talking about Classroom 180, a framework for creating, sustaining, and assessing the trauma-informed classroom. As always, you'll have an opportunity we're going to do an interview format today. So you have an opportunity to ask questions during the presentation. So don't be shy. Feel free to jump in if you have a question, and we'll be looking for those in the live chat. Happy to ask your question. As always, we are recording the session, so it will be available live on Facebook, YouTube, and on LinkedIn now, but it'll also be available on those platforms after the fact. And we also make it available as an audio podcast. So you are welcome and encouraged to go and listen to it later. And also share these. One of the big reasons we do these is we want to encourage people to share them. We've got a lot of fantastic information, and we really want to make sure that people are sharing them with others that they are working with. If you're a parent, sharing them with your teachers and your staff. If you are a teacher, sharing it with your fellow educators. Really great content here. So with all that said, welcome and thanks for joining us. I want to go ahead and introduce to all of you Heather Forbes. And Heather Forbes is a licensed clinical social worker, the owner of the Beyond Consequences Institute. And if you're anything like me, you probably love the title of that, Beyond Consequences. That really resonates with me. And the author, of course, of numerous books on the topic of working with children impacted by trauma. And I've got a couple of those here with me, but we'll be talking about some of these throughout the course of the day. Coming from a family of educators, Heather has a passion for helping children in the classroom. Trauma robs children of their curiosity, and Heather's passion is to help these students return back to their innate love for learning. So important. The love of learning is so important, and there's a lot of roadblocks to that. Our school systems sometimes are not set up in ways that especially kids that are having a difficult time are able to really fall in love with learning, and that's a great goal. Heather consults and lectures extensively with both general and special education schools around the nation and world. I know you actually speak at a lot of conferences and events, and we were just talking about one that you've got coming up here. Your signature style is to bridge the gap between academic research and kind of when the rubber hits the road, classroom situations. Such an important place to look because it's easy to look at things in a perfect scenario, but classrooms can be anything but, as I'm sure you can relate. Trying to give teachers and school personnel the understanding and tools they need for even the most challenging of students. Heather has worked in schools with trauma-impacted students and knows firsthand how challenging it can be on a daily basis with these students. So has a lot of empathy towards the teachers and staff that are trying to really help kids. Much of Heather's insight and understanding on trauma, disruptive behaviors, and developmental delays comes from her own experience of raising two internationally adopted children and mentoring a severely trauma-impacted young adult. So Heather, with that introduction, welcome. We're really excited to have you here today.
Well, thank you. It's wonderful to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. We're always interested in having these conversations, and sharing the wealth of knowledge that's out there about how we can better support kids. And, when I first came across your work, there were some things that began to resonate with me. And then as I had a chance to dig in deeper, so much of what you say and so much of what you do is really helping to move educators and even families in a better direction, getting a better understanding of trauma, and hopefully better able to support kids that sometimes have not traditionally been well supported. So really excited to have you here. So let's start. I have a lot of questions for you, but let's just start with a little bit of background. So you're, of course, a licensed clinical social worker, and I will tell you what I tell most of the social workers I talk to, and I don't tell the other professionals I talk to this. Social workers are almost always the nicest people that you ever meet. There's something about social work that tends to bring out amazing people. So, you're of course a licensed clinical social worker. We talked in your intro about, kind of your own connections, but how did you end up down the pathway that you've gone in terms of becoming an expert on trauma, becoming an expert on kids? Can you tell us a little bit more about your story?
Yeah, I love you in my story because it's so different. I actually once upon a time I was working in the field of architecture, and that's of course completely different from what I'm doing now. And when it came time to build my family, for various reasons we ended up adopting, and I had no idea what trauma looked like, none. And so both my children were adopted from Russia. They're both actually 28 years old now, but they went through a lot of early childhood trauma. And, I just thought I'd be like every other mom and put the kids in the minivan and drive to the play dates and everything would be happy. And oh my gosh, I came in upon a completely different scenario. My son was incredibly aggressive. I can just remember like having this out of body experience in watching my son and the aggression at 5 years old, thinking this isn't possible. How is this even possible that a child can be so violent? And so that really kind of set the course because I didn't know what to do. And every single parenting book that I read, not only did it not work, it actually made things worse. And so I was getting to a very desperate place. And also my daughter, she was on the other side of the spectrum where instead of the outward expression of her trauma, it was an inward expression. And, I kept saying she's too good. Like there's something wrong. There's something just not right here. And so that led me in my course. And then I ended up going back to school. And when you say social workers are the nicest people, that was my first experience because I walked into the social work office saying, hey, here I am with a master's in construction management and I'd like to be a social worker. And I was like blown away on how nice everyone was. And so I was like, I found my people. And so that led me then to do research and to understand that it's not just about a child that's having just a bad day and making a bad choice, that this is truly at a deep neurological level. And so understanding the brain science behind behaviors is which led me to develop my career in this and the books that I have written, because I think coming at this as a parent who didn't know what to do in our own home. And then obviously when my children got into school and things were unraveling very quickly, I've worked at it from the school level as well, that I have this passion to say, no, we're not going to do the things that I did to my kids. And I say that from, I was told to do these things. And again, the clearing out the guilt that I did all the wrong stuff because I just didn't have the understanding. And I think that's where I really want to stress with my work is that this is truly about just shifting our understanding of why children do the things that they do. And then, of course, on the other side of that is then what do we do? And that's really what has led me into the work I do. So my heart is all in. And I will say on the personal side, my children, like I said, are 28 years old and they're doing pretty well. Trauma is a lifelong journey, but it is truly because I finally found the right understanding myself. But then with that, my children would not be where they are today had they not had the schools finally that I had with teachers and administrators who finally got them. And I give all that credit to their education that helped move them. You can only do so much as a parent. And when you have the correct environment and the right environment for your children when they're at school, because what is that? At least 6 hours a day for 5 days a week. It has a tremendous influence on how children can not only change their behavior, but find healing as well. And so I just always want to give a shout out to educators for me personally, for what they've done to create, the environment my children needed to be who they are today.
Yeah, and I'm sure, like many of us, that knowing all that you know now, you probably think, well, gee, if only I could go back, right? Because, on these journeys, along our way, we learn better ways. And of course, when we learn better, we need to do better. But it really is a journey. And, I think about my life as a father raising a neurodivergent son. And again, think about, wow, gee, I wish I knew these things then. But there were things I learned along the way that were transformative. And you took that, even so much further by kind of dedicating and changing your career and diving into, I mean, the brain science is so important. Looking at the child differently because you understand what's going on in the brain, the impact of trauma is so critical. But I love also that, you put the grace in there that, we know better, we do know better. And that's what this is about, right? So how can we help people to know better ways? You mentioned adoption. And of course, I think back to Bruce Perry's work, probably, work of your own as well, talking about, even the criticalness of the first several months of life. And people often don't realize that the traumas that can then happen very early, even pre-birth, the traumas that may happen to an individual and generational trauma and other things that can affect a child. So I'm sure that for you, it was a surprise kind of learning about trauma. So how did you begin that really kind of understanding or reframing things to see it differently in the case of your own children?
Well, what I really understood was the basic concept that when trauma happens to children, they're impacted by that they switch from living in a platform of love, where if you take your typical child, that when they're born, they're loved, they're nurtured, and they receive love. And as you raise a child, like you have to teach them not to talk to strangers. Like you have to teach a little bit of fear just to make sure they're safe, right? Well, that's your typical child. And that's where most parenting books are coming from. And that's where we look at kids from that perspective. But when children are impacted by trauma, they switch from a platform of love to a platform of fear. So everything that they do, everything that they interpret, everything that comes at them or they experience, depending where they are on that timeline of their trauma and what the impact was and how the severity of it, they're going to look at things definitely from a framework of fear. And I've worked with, I was talking to a parent just the other day, and she's got a 24-year-old that has a lot of trauma in her history. And, even at 24 years old, it's hard for that parent to even make a loving connection, because then automatically the child says, oh, what, am I not good enough? When the mom offers, well, why don't you take this, to help you feel better? What, am I not good enough? Everything gets interpreted from a negative perspective. And so that's what we have to, I think, really hold strong, is that if you are looking at the world from a platform of fear, you are going to have everything a little bit shifted, and your perspective is going to be changed. And that is ultimately going to lead to a very different behavioral response. And so behaviors are simply an indication of where that child's coming from. And when we could really understand that platform of either love or fear, it can be a game changer on how we then interact with a child. Because if you have a child that's just being negative at home or at school or wherever, and you say, okay, Billy, well, if you don't straighten up, I'm going to take a point off your point chart, or I'm going to, ground you for a day. Then what you're doing is adding more fear. You're trying to change behavior through a fear-based modality. And so you can't add fear to fear and get love. It doesn't equate. What happens is that you add fear to a child who's already in fear, and you get more fear. And that's why we see a lot of children's behaviors completely escalate.
Right.
And I think that's what I really want to show the difference is, and I use the analogy of Andy versus Billy. So Andy is just the child. It used to be like child A, but I was like, hey, we need a name for the child. So,
but I like that Andy starts with an A and Billy starts with a B.
That's
so
all it is.
You followed with it.
Andy and girl or boy, I try to use gender neutral names, but if you kind of threaten Andy with say, hey, I'm going to take a point off your point chart, Andy goes, whoa, I don't want a point off. And Andy still lives in love and still has the ability in the brain to process sequential thinking and goes, well, okay, I'm going to change my behavior. So a lot of the things we've done in the past did work with Andy, even though if they were fear-based. The problem is when you have a child or a student who is working from a platform of fear, if you add in more fear, it's not going to work the same way it does with Andy. And that's the basic difference between our kids who have that history of some sort of trauma that has shifted where they are neurologically and just within their mindset.
So I'm going to just remind people who are watching live to please introduce yourself and tell us where you're from, where you're watching from today. And Heather, I'll let you know that we typically have people from all over the world that join in. It's really interesting. We have people from Australia, New Zealand, the UK, all over the world. So hopefully a couple people will tell us where they're coming from today, and we'll see. But also, if you have questions as we're going along, please feel free to put those in the chat, and I'll be monitoring the chat for any questions. Now, you introduced Billy and Andy, and I was going to ask you about that, but I'm going to skip forward and get to that in a minute. Do me a favor, if you would, talk to us a little bit about, we talk about trauma, and of course, for all of us who have been talking about trauma a lot, we just say trauma, and we are all on the same page. But if you would, walk us through, what are we talking about when we're talking about trauma, and share a little bit of that brain science as well. What impact does that trauma then have on the brain? Because we know the downstream, we know that it might result in behavior, right? But can you walk through with people kind of a little bit about trauma and a little bit about how trauma impacts the brain?
No, I think it's a great place to start, because the word trauma sounds really big, like it has to be some big event. It doesn't have to be a big event.
Right.
What I like to define trauma is the experience of feeling hopeless, helpless, or powerless. So it's not the event itself, it's the perception. And I think we all can relate to this, because if you have siblings in your family and growing up, you gather around as adults and you talk about some childhood experience, and every single person has a different perspective of the experience. It's the same event, but how you experience it is different. And so it's not always the event itself. It's obvious then a child that's coming out of foster care that's trauma. But I've worked with kids who have come out of foster care, have had some really wonderful support around them, and they weren't as traumatized as another child coming out of foster care. So it's not that, it's really so much about the child's personality as well. So I think we have to really understand that it's not as obvious. I like to talk about what I call the 50 shades of trauma, that there's always some just very subtle pieces of trauma. And I think also in our society as a culture, we're like, well, they're fine. Their family's getting divorced, but they're fine. Well, divorce is the death of a family from a child's perspective. And of course, every child thinks, oh, it's my fault that this happened. And, no judgment around that. Sometimes it's the best situation for the family in the long term. I always just look at it from the child's perspective, that it is a traumatic experience. Of course it is. And so what happens then when these experiences when that child's going through the experience, and again, it can be like a one incident trauma, or it can be pervasive through that childhood. And you talked also about the early childhood trauma, in utero trauma. Sometimes I've worked with kids that were the hardest ever, and it was the in utero trauma that really set the stage, because that is a child that's basically woven in trauma in the womb. They're baked in cortisol, the stress hormone. And so what happens is that whether it's in the womb or later on in life, you have children who are very, very sensitive to stress. They've been in situations as young children, vulnerable children, that they experience this high stress level, and they didn't know how to bring it back down without the loving, caring adult around them. And so now you have children who are just charged up. They are revved up. And that revved up can also, though, be the child who's shut down. I want to make sure we're clear on that. It's not always the child that comes out swinging, but both ends of the spectrum, either hypo-aroused or hyper-aroused, as we call it. And so now what I like to say, just in general terms, we can put a label on it like PTSD. We can call that child oppositional defiant disorder. Those mental health diagnoses are important, but I think from a everyday perspective, whether a parent or a teacher, administrator, that to understand this child is to understand that they have a high sensitivity to stress. Their nervous systems are going to get charged up very easily. So you may have an incident that Andy may be able to be a little upset, but recover pretty quickly. But that same incident, you have Billy, whose system is already charged up, and bam, we have a complete meltdown, and we have a child that is completely out of control, completely dysregulated. And it's not that they're being bad. They're not being dramatic. It's just how they are now programmed. I think that we also have to look at the brain science to understand that when a child is going through an emotional experience, that they're going to be really living out of the lower part of the brain, which is the midbrain, which also has the limbic system. And in basic terms, all that's saying is that you have a child that the blood flow in the brain is going to where the emotions are processed. And in that part of the brain is where the fear receptor is. But there's also the pleasure seeking part of the brain. It's basically every decision that they're making is going to be based off of the emotional response, not off of the logical response and not off of a rational response. Again, I always like to go back to our own experiences. If you've ever been upset over something and you weren't very rational about it, and then someone said, "Hey, I've got a great solution," and they give you all rational thinking, did it not make you upset? You're like, "You don't listen to me. I'm upset right now." So there's really a distinct part of our brain that when we are engaged in a conversation at the emotional level, that's really going to help us when we're living in that part of the brain that is very engaged in fear and perception of fear. And what I always like to say is that the lower part of the brain is not about right or wrong. It's about win or lose. And that's why moving into a power struggle with a child that's in that lower part of the brain, which is our billies for the most part, is that you're going to jump into a power struggle and no one's going to win. That's where things get escalated. So, probably a long answer to your question, but it's really
Great answer. Yeah.
understanding the nervous system and where they are operating in their brain.
Right. So again, kind of, kids that have been through, well, trauma can be experienced differently, but kids that might have a reaction to trauma that causes them to feel less safe, that causes them to be hyper vigilant, more apt to then probably have behaviors, right?
Yes.
So what does this look like? What does this look like? Let's use two examples here. Let's start at home. So what is a hyper-vigilant child, or what does a child that's been through trauma look like at home?
They're going to be super reactive,
Mhm.
and they're going to see everything in a way that they need to know what's going to happen. Like they're always on guard. Like when you go through a traumatic experience, you were caught by surprise. So the basic understanding is trauma happens by surprise. So in reaction to that, children are always going to be ready for the next thing, no matter what happens. They're always going to be in that negative perspective. And these are the kids where nothing is ever right. Everything is negative because they're always making sure they're never going to be caught by surprise again. And this can boil down to very basic things. I like to relate it either in the home or in the classroom. Let's say Billy says, "Hey, mom, dad, can we have pizza on Friday night?" Or maybe Billy at school says, "Hey, can we have, an extra half hour at recess?" And the parent, they're like, "Well, I'm not sure. We'll consider that when we get to that place." They don't want to commit because they're afraid of backing away from that and not being able to follow through. Well, that kind of non-committal actually puts Billy in a place of more fear because you see, there's no certainty in that. It's more uncertainty. And so Billy lives in a place that he or she needs to have certainty. The answers have to be yes or no. And there has to be concrete this and concrete that. And that's a really hard place to live out of. You have to like plan to be spontaneous with Billy, right? Because you can't do things by surprise until that child is in a better place. So living with a child like this and having a child like that in the classroom, it's just you have to start understanding why that reactivity is there and not take it as, well, nothing ever satisfies Billy. Well, whatever I say just makes him upset. No, what you're saying are things that are getting him into a place where he's more uncertain. And you've got to create that sense of all rightness and that sense of certainty and be able to follow through with that as well.
So, if you think about a lot of the traditional approaches, a lot of traditional approaches look at all behavior as being a matter of choice, right? Everything's volitional. We're making
That
choices. We're
makes my
making
skin crawl when I hear that. You're right.
Yeah. No. Right. But that's this traditional
It
approach
is.
that everything is a matter of a child making a choice. Of course, we know through this lens that that's just simply not true. We know that there are kind of those bottom up and top down kind of behaviors. But the common approach is it's a matter of choice. And when people look at things as a matter of choice, what do? They offer rewards, consequences. So think about how this might play out in a home environment, where suddenly Billy is having things taken away, or other consequences imposed, or maybe it's some kind of reward system. Let's contrast that with a better approach. So, how does Billy respond to those things being taken away, or that kind of punitive approach? And what do you think is a better approach?
Yeah, punitive approaches are going to sink Billy even lower into that midbrain, and ultimately sometimes down in what we call the reptilian brain. And that's where children can come out swinging and get aggressive. Let's talk about the sort of the psychology of it. Because what happens also with trauma is that many children, even in homes that are just super loving homes, when trauma happens, again, it shifts kids, and their belief system about who they are can very much shift, because then all of a sudden they realize that they're different than the other kids. And we can try to convince them, oh, no, you're fine. But no, they know that they're unique and they're different. And so, of course, different as for any child means I'm not good enough. I'm not lovable. And so a lot of our children and our students feel that they aren't deserving of love. I can't tell you how many children in my private practice, when I was doing work with families, literally at 5 years old, would say, I don't deserve to be on this planet. I mean, I pause on that. So then you take away something from a child that feels that way, and then it reinforces their negative belief system. And so they're like, well, see, I don't deserve to be on this planet because my mom just took away my toy or took away my privilege. And so therefore that only proves that I'm a bad kid and I'm unworthy and I'm unlovable. So these consequences that we give without relational support will then create more of the same and create more of our Billies. So that's why we can't do that. The other thing is, let me go back to the comment about it's always a choice, right? Kids just need to make a better choice. We put children in timeout. Again, home or school, we put them in timeout because we really want you to think about doing the right thing next time. What can you do better? Well, what Billy thinks about is how not to get caught, because Billy's in that place of fear. And so here's the other thing when it comes to brain science is that when you're in the lower part of the brain, which is, again, is the emotional part of the brain, you don't have the ability to think logically, to think rationally, to think morals and ethics and good judgment. That's in the higher part of the brain. And so we're asking children who are dysregulated in the lower part of the brain to think clearly. It doesn't match the brain science at all. It's absolutely ridiculous. And so that's why we have kids who you put them in timeout for 5 minutes and they get worse and they get worse and they don't learn their lesson, so to speak. So let me talk about the reverse. How then do we still hold children accountable? I think that's one of the things that I've really tried to stress over the last 5 or 10 years, because when I first started doing this work, I think that it got misinterpreted. When we say beyond consequences, people say, well, then we just don't give any consequences. Well, that's not good either. You have to teach the life lesson, and you have to give kids some sort of accountability. I don't like the word consequences at all, because consequences implies that there's punishment. What I like to think about, and I talk about this in Classroom 180, is about discipline and empowerment. So you're going to maybe remove that child from the situation at hand. Let's say Billy, doesn't get to go outside and play with his friends because he has been disruptive or can't go out to recess at school. So yes, the accountability is to say, hey, Billy, you know what? I'm going to have you stay with me instead of going to recess or instead of going outside. But giving Billy permission to be upset, to say, hey, you're going to not like that I'm in charge. You're going to not like that I've made this decision. And we reframe it in a way that's all about the connection, to say, I am taking responsibility to make sure that I am always putting you in a place where you have the best opportunity. Right now, being outside with your friends, it's not going to go well. I just know that. So I want you to stay with me so I can help you. So we do what I call as a time in. So you still take away the privilege or whatever that thing is, but how you actually put it into practice and the application of it is with a we statement or an I statement, is to say, I'm still here with you. I'm taking responsibility. I'm going to be here. And you know what? And while you're in this time in with me, I'm going to teach you how to do this differently. A lot of our children have what I call maladaptive coping mechanisms, meaning that they don't know how to do it differently. We have to teach them how to do it differently. Discipline, the root word of discipline is to teach.
Right.
Somehow we've decided that discipline is about punishing kids. And we
Yeah.
have this need to punish in our society. As a whole culture, we have to punish people. Well, I think it's true that we need to hold people accountable and children accountable, because that's just good parenting. And that's where our kids need some guidance. But we do it in a way that is loving, in a way that is kind, in a way that is emotionally supportive, in a way that our relationship is still intact. And so they don't go through that piece of feeling like they're rejected or they're abandoned. And we're not reinforcing the negative belief systems. In fact, we're making sure that they know we've got their back and that we unconditionally love them. It's about helping them move from that state of fear into a place of love. And that takes unconditional love. To say, I love you enough to be with you. I love you enough to help you and to guide you and to help you and to nurture you. But yeah, we're going to have to miss a few things along the way, but we're going to make sure that next time when you go out to recess, the next time you go out there, you're better equipped, because I know that you can do this. I know that you have more potential. I see the special in you. That's what our kids really need to be able to make the changes.
Yeah, the relational safety is so critical. I mean, you can't get anywhere without that. And I love, because I kept thinking it as you were talking, that you kind of brought up the root word for discipline, because very often it's about punishment, people wanting to do things to people rather than how can we teach, how can we support, how can we connect. Yeah, such important points. So let's think about Billy for a second. I want to kind of put together a scenario. Billy having had some trauma, having had some behavior, first year teacher in a classroom has Billy in their class. What does Billy look like to that teacher? And then we'll take the next step after that. I mean, how might Billy present to that teacher in a classroom?
Well, I think at first, a lot of times our Billies will be like the most loving kids. A lot of times they're actually very manipulative, because they've learned how to really read adults. And so you won't be able to tell from the outside, right? So what I want to say first is that there's no big sign on Billy. And so and that's the hard part, because all of a sudden kids will present pretty well. And so then you think, okay, great, we've got an Andy here. And then all of a sudden, when the stress starts happening, when all of a sudden the academics start coming into play, when some social issues start happening that Billy doesn't know how to navigate through, the eruption of the behaviors can be so extreme compared to your Andys. And so this surprise factor can happen, because you expect an Andy response, and all of a sudden you get this Billy response and you didn't see it coming. So sometimes I think people are a little blindsided. And so that's the outward expression. And what does that look like? I mean, it can be so many different things. It can be that child that comes in just cussing and swearing and basically is there to shock somebody's nervous system. And it can look like a child that has what we call the school counselors and mental health. We watch kids and we write up these reports and we say, student has problems with authority. Well, it's not problems with authority. It's a fear of those in authority. And so we put all these labels and this terminology, and we see it for this negative behavioral response. We've got all these nice little key words that we use, non-compliant, disrespectful, lazy. And so when you're using words like that, I just encourage everyone to stop and say, okay, but why? Why is this child, quote, lazy? Why is this child not focused? Why is this child talking back to me? And it's kind of hard, because we're so trained to just change the behavior. But to take that moment, and that's where mindfulness is really important, to say, okay, I got a Billy. Now, what's really going on here? I love the question that says, what is driving this behavior?
Right.
So it's getting to know Billy. Why? Why is Billy being obnoxious? Why is Billy being non-compliant? I mean, these are all real behaviors. I'm not against the words themselves, but you can't just stop there. You got to go to the next step and ask why.
Yeah. So let's think about a couple things. I mean, one is that we know, if we look at discipline data, And unfortunately, discipline in this context, not meaning the teaching kids, but
Right.
providing consequences, which might be, I mean, in some cases, it's things like restraint seclusion. Others, it's suspension and expulsion. Still, we have states that still allow corporal punishment. Some of this
Some
discipline
states are
data.
going back to it, I read.
I know, Cassville, Missouri.
Mhm.
We're keeping a close eye on them. That's really disheartening. But um, you know, many of the kids that we're talking about are children with disabilities, Black and brown children, and children with a trauma history, very young children. So, if we begin to look at, the kids that are impacted by this and then trace through what often happens in a school, what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about one of the things that we commonly see happen. And then I want to shift into kind of talking about your Classroom's 180 approach and how that can head us in a different direction. But, very often, again, if we look at the kids that are being affected, they often are kids with a trauma history. I've had the firm belief for some time that there's a huge intersection between disability and trauma. Kids with disabilities often carry trauma related to their disability. Can be manifested in a lot of different ways. But kids that are having behaviors, very often the approach in a school might be to do a functional behavioral assessment, and in that process they identify a functional behavior. One of the top four was attention seeking, it was avoiding, it was gaining access to something, whatever it may be. Very simple definition, and personally I think behavior is more complicated, but a very simple view on that. And then often what comes is, okay, well, we what happened before that, what's the antecedent? And often the antecedents, in my experience and a lot of the people that we work with, they don't dig very deep. So they look at the thing that happened immediately before, not all of the, Billy's mother and father divorced this week, and this happened and that happened. It's only that one thing that happened before. And then they come up with a consequence. And the consequence, of course, is often an adult imposed the consequence without consulting the child. So you end up with a, response that comes out of a, functional behavioral assessment into a behavior plan that often aren't helping kids, that often are very steeped in rewards, very steeped in consequences, and don't seem to really be helping kids that need help the most. I've had personal experience and know many that have had similar experience with well-intentioned programs and plans with really great sounding names, positive behavior, interventions and supports and other things that sometimes are very steeped in this idea of rewards. And I tend to fall kind of on the Alfie Cohen side of life, of that, I see rewards can be very similar to punishment. And that there may get you short-term compliance, but don't typically give you the result of helping kids. So that's the model that happens in a lot of places across the country, is this kind of idea of we look at the antecedent behavior and come up with a consequence, and it's often very steep in rewarding consequence. So how does your work, being trauma informed, kind of the Classroom's 180 approach, how do you move beyond that?
I think it's also starting with another concept of understanding the difference between regulation and dysregulation.
Mhm.
When, just as human beings, when we are regulated, then our bodies are in balance, we are in homeostasis. And we all go through a state of regulation, hopefully during the day. If we can, but we also go through these states of dysregulation. Like if I get thirsty, right, I'm going to pick up my water and I'm going to drink. My body is getting dysregulated and getting off balance because I need water. That's a very simple explanation. The commercials now with, I think it's Snickers, and you get hangry, right? Because you're hungry and your behavior changes. You are hungry and you get angry. And so I think it's a great way to look at it, is that when our kids are dysregulated, and that might be emotional dysregulation, it might be physical dysregulation, it might be just mental health illness or something, maybe just when we're not well. I think that's what all of us can understand. Like the last time that you were sick or something, were you really nice and kind? We probably had to work at it, right? You just aren't very nice and grumpy. You're just grumpy, right? And sleep deprivation can be one. So our kids, though, don't have the coping mechanisms on how to move from a state of dysregulation back to a state of regulation. So what I say is that when you see a child who is acting out in a negative behavioral way, What you want to start doing is looking at how you can help that child move from a state of dysregulation back to a state of regulation. Again, throw out the whole choice thing, because once they are regulated, well, then you can start talking about the choice. Then you can start talking about what to do next time. But you have to have a child in a state of regulation in order to learn. And so when I work with educators, it's that simple of a concept. If you want academic excellence, if you want your children to reach their high potential of their academics, you have to make sure that they are regulated. And so when you're dysregulated, what we see are kids who can't focus, who can't sit still. And then, of course, then the ones with real negative behaviors. So as a blanket statement, I basically like to say, if you see a child that's acting out, you have a child who's dysregulated.
Right.
So the goal then with discipline or with a consequence or whatever you want to call it, is that you're just simply trying to move that child into a state of regulation. And our kids, like I said, they don't know how to do that. Andy comes into the school where they've learned to do some self-regulation. They've learned to have a little bit greater capacity to be able to have that flexibility that when they're a little mad or grumpy, they know how to get regulated again. They know how to ask for help. They can receive help. Our Billies, they get dysregulated, and guess what? They kind of stay there. They don't know how to shift up into a place of regulation. And again, what is that underlying cause? Like you said, it could be a disability. It could be a child with trauma. It could be all the above. It could be physical, whatever. But just again, working with those two statements. And I will say this is that a few years ago, I gave a training. I'm from Boulder, Colorado, and I gave like a 45-minute training to a school where I knew the principal and I knew the vice principal. I just did it as a favor. And I went in for 45 minutes. I gave them the Help for Billy book. And I talked about these concepts of regulation, dysregulation in the brain. And that's about all I talked about. And then I went back a year later and I said, hey, how are things going? And they literally looked at me and said, everything has changed. And I said, what do you mean? They said, well, we finally understood how to look at our Billies from a place of dysregulation because there's no judgment there. You see, there's no criticism there. It's just Billy's dysregulated. And then the question is, how do we get them regulated? So everything that you do at that point is created to move a child back into a state of regulation. And so, yes, that might mean, like I said, pull the kid out of recess. But what you're going to do when you pull them out of recess is not get them more dysregulated by making them write 100 times, I will behave in class. You pull them into a relationship, you walk, talk, and regulate around the track or around the school, and you get that child just to start talking and not to teach the lesson, but to relate and connect.
Right.
We are designed to be in human relationships. We are a social creature. And so by pulling kids into you and having them connect with a loving, caring adult that they somewhat trust, I want to say we'd love them to trust us 100%, but that takes time.
Right.
They can start moving back into a state of regulation. It takes human connection. And let me give you an example I think that we can all relate to. Let's say you have a baby and newborn infant, the baby starts crying. And it's 2 a.m. You're a new mom, a new dad. You're tired. Do you walk in or, go to the crib and say, you need to stop crying right now. This is not allowed. It's 2 a.m. You're not allowed to be awake till 6 a.m. I mean, that's ridiculous. We don't do that. But what we do is we pick up that infant and we hold the infant in connection and relationship, and we rock the infant and we love on that infant, and we get that regulated to go back to bed. Now, I know that's an infant, but I want you to take that same concept and relate it to the 6-year-old, the 12-year-old, the 18-year-old, your spouse, your partner, your in-laws, your outlaws, like take that concept. When people are dysregulated, can you let go of the behavior, come into connection and just relate to them and be there as a calm adult that they can regulate off of you? You see, this is a co-regulation model.
Right.
You have to be calm for them to be able to regulate off of you. And so that's to answer your question. What do you do then? Well, you do things that are about time ends. You do things to say, well, I can see you're really upset right now. You know what? Instead of just sitting here and trying to calm down, you're too upset. How about, we go out and we hit the punching bag, or I have this big heavy ball that I call Mr. Slammy, and I have kids just slam it on, just get out that that anger, get out that frustration. Again, I think we can relate to that when you go work out, like you
Mhm.
push some weights and you just feel better. So physical exercise sometimes is the right thing. Sometimes the best thing is to sit down and give a child something to color. And coloring books are made for adults now. So some of our older kids can color and be able to calm down. So everything that you do from a disciplinary standpoint is all based off of regulation.
Right, right,
And
right. Yeah, and of course, I'm thinking here, Bruce Perry. I'm thinking, regulate, relate, reason, and the important message there for us, right, is that if a child is dysregulated, we're not going to access the reason, right? And how often, are children dysregulated? The adults sometimes become dysregulated, and at that moment, we're not we've got to use the relational safety. We've got to use all that we can to reach that point of regulation. And as I listened to you, I actually had a brief conversation this morning with Dr. Stuart Shanker, and of course, self-reg, and he talks very much about homeostasis, and the idea of kind of the stress that's affecting us. And, when you begin to look at dysregulation is an accumulation of various stressors that are affecting us. And sometimes we look at the behavior and we judge that without realizing that here's somebody that's under all of this stress, all of this potential trauma, and how do we help them so that we can relate to them. I love that. I always love that concept of kind of homeostasis, like we're trying to get them back to that even point of regulation. Yeah. Now, if you would, we've been talking a lot about Billy, and I've got, of course, a copy of your book here, A Help for Billy. And, the book, of course, talks about Billy, as an example. And can you just tell us a little bit about Help for Billy? And, I think it's a great read for people, and certainly people that are part of our audience. We've got a lot of teachers and a lot of parents, um,
Sure. Yeah, no, Help for Billy was really written based off of how to help Billy in the classroom, how to help students who are chronically dysregulated in the classroom. And so the first part of the book talks about the concepts that I've talked about today, and the brain, and just the regulation, dysregulation, the belief system. And then the second part of the book is more strategy driven. And again, what to do, the application of that when the rubber hits the road type of things. It actually came after all the parenting books I had written, because the parenting books are the same concept. For the parenting books, I made sure I put examples, of course, as a parent and what kids do in the home. But so this is just taking those same concepts and relating it to what that can look like in the classroom, and how teachers can be better equipped and better empowered to have success. Because when you start doing the traditional things, and with Billy, I tell you, as a teacher, as an adult, an educator in the schools, it can get so frustrating, because you're like, why is this not working? Why is it working with Andy, but it's not working for Billy? And so it really gives the explanation and the understanding as to why things do have to be a little bit different for our kids that are impacted by trauma.
And of course, you've taken that further now, and I have in front of me a copy of Classroom 180, and that's really about a framework for really helping educators in the classroom. You mentioned, or was in your introduction, about being from a family of educators, and I'm sure that educators are probably near and dear to your heart. But another really important part about all of this is that. And I remember you mentioning this in something I was listening to where you were talking, but about the amount of time a child spends in a school every day, and how much influence that time can have. And I have heard from sometimes from frustrated educators saying, well, we just don't control what happens to them at home, and there's so much else that's happening. But the truth is that there's such an opportunity with the time that they might have in a school to be that safe place for that kid, because there are some kids that don't have safety at home for a lot of different reasons, or don't have the relational support. So, tell me a little bit about Classrooms 180, kind of, why the book was written, and really what the aim of this is. I mean, it's obviously very focused on how do we help educators, and of course, there could probably be no more important time for a book like this. You and I were talking before we went on, and these last couple of years have been extremely traumatic. The world pandemic, lots of interesting things went on in the world that have made it stressful. We knew prior to kids going back to school that we would probably see an increase in behaviors, an increase in stress, an increase in trauma. So the timing for something like this is really relevant. So tell us a little bit about Classroom 180.
So it is definitely a like volume 2 of Help for Billy, and then more expansive. What's been exciting is in the last 5 years or so, there has been an awareness of needing to be more trauma informed in schools. And so there's been a lot of people with wonderful ideas and strategies and techniques. And what I found happening was that, like, I used to hold these conferences where we would, for 3 days, talk about all the different strategies to use, and they were great ideas. And then people would come up to me after 3 days of all this and look at me and go, "But what do I do? I'm so overwhelmed."
Right.
And I was like, "Oh, there's no framework, there's no roadmap." So Classroom 180 is a framework, it's a roadmap to understand how to implement a trauma-informed approach. And so I use 5 domains. One of those domains is what you were just saying, is about kids that don't come from really strong family systems. Is that the first domain is like, okay, the starting point for any teacher is to build that classroom as if it's a family. I like the word community, but I just love the word family. I'm a family therapist, and that's where children really thrive, is in a beautiful family. So building that connection and relationships and creating this when you walk into that classroom, you kind of feel like you've come home. And whether that's at the elementary school level, middle, or high school as well, it can happen. And then the domains build from there. One of the domains is then about regulation. The next one's about language of trauma. How do you learn to have different dialogue when that child is in your face or shooting you a bird and they're ready to say, or they've just said F off or whatever language has come out? If you go into that and say, "Don't you use that language in my classroom?" Well, we all know what's going to happen. They're going to use more of that language in the classroom. And so it's about learning a different dialogue. And then the fourth domain is about safety, so that we don't have, we need to do way more proactive work to make sure that we are creating a classroom that is physically safe. And so that we don't end up in these seclusions and restraints and things. And because I think those happen because there isn't enough proactive work around that. And then the fifth domain is what we've been talking about, that accountability piece. It's called discipline and empowerment. Again, I love those 2 words together. It's about then, of course, training and teaching our kids. And so there's 5 domains, but there's actually 27 components. So those components may mean, okay, well, one of the components is about social emotional learning. One of the components is about restorative practices, right? One of the components is about teacher-student relationships. And so it's taking then and breaking all these wonderful pieces that we have about how to create a trauma-informed classroom, but giving educators a roadmap so that they have and they know what to do for the first year, for the third year, for the fifth year, for, how do you build this out? How do you build capacity for this, not just in your classroom, but your school and your entire district as well? And this book, it really gives the manual for how to do that.
And you're accompanying that with some training as well, right? Did you have some virtual training and
I
events?
do. I just started one last night, in fact,
Okay.
and that's the blessing of the pandemic, is I
Right.
figured out how to do this. So I don't even do it at my office here. I do it, and I have a whole studio set up where it's a
Oh,
lot
wow.
more interactive. I'm standing
Sure.
up, I'm talking. It's as if you're there in person almost,
Mhm, mhm.
So we put the time so that educators can do it after class. We had a huge cohort this summer because teachers finally had a chance to get a little revitalized, but they're like, yeah, I better get ready to be ready when kids come back, because COVID was a huge piece. What we have seen is a lot of our Andes come back to
Mhm,
school like
mhm,
our Billies.
mhm,
So yeah, the training opportunities are all on my website, but I would,
mhm,
reading the book, I just want to bring it to life and give people real examples. And we
mhm,
actually,
mhm.
last night, I'll tell you, we did a role play. I had one of the participants come up and do a role play, and she was phenomenal. She ended up in tears like a Billy would be. And so we get as real as possible
Yeah,
as
yeah,
we
yeah, 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 yeah. Well, that's
yeah,
important. I mean, that reality, that emotional connection that happens with reality probably has a lot to do with really imprinting on people's memory as well. I mean, we know that we remember things when there's emotion attached
exactly.
to it.
Yeah.
So there's some good science there behind that. So tell me about that virtual. I mean, is that happen over a number of weeks, or there are cohorts that you move through? How many weeks is a program like that? Or
It's actually 4 sessions, and we have variations. So the one we started last night, it's one session per month. So it gives you 4 months so that you can like go to the session, put it into practice, and then come back and go, but wait a minute, this didn't work. What do I do now? And then we
I
also
love that.
have,
That's so important, right?
right.
Because it's easy to go through something and then you get back in your environment and it ends up in the back of your
It's,
head. But
you go
having that,
right back to the same old stuff. You stress, you
that's right.
regress, and you go back to the
Yeah,
same old. So yes, this
yeah.
is about learning to really put it into practice. And then we also actually, I have a group next week starting on next Thursday, and we meet one session per week for 4 weeks. So that one goes for 4 weeks straight. Because I think a lot of that one's actually filling up more because I think educators are like, I can't wait 4 months. I need it right now. Because we're seeing a lot of increase in the intensity of these behaviors, and
Right,
now's the
right.
time to stop this and
Yeah.
really be
Well,
able to shift
and we
things.
have to keep in mind something I think that gets forgotten a lot, is not just that the kids go through this trauma and stress, but the
Mhm.
teachers did, the staff did.
Absolutely.
And I always have this thought in my head when it comes to, uh, you know, the idea of trauma informed, of course, can mean a lot of different things. It can mean a really in-depth approach like what you're talking about, but sometimes it means we attended a 30-minute professional development training and
Right.
now we're calling ourselves trauma informed.
Exactly.
I'm a big believer that to truly be trauma informed, it has to happen through the fabric of an organization or a school. So
Mhm.
you've got to be trauma informed with your staff and with your
Yes.
educators and with
Right.
others. But this kind of program that you're talking about, so great. And you did one in Denver, right? A live event.
I did a live one. Yay, finally got to do my first live one.
Are you
And
doing more events like that as well,
we
or?
will we will do another one in June in
Okay,
Denver. So,
okay,
and that one, of course, I mean, virtual is great because people can make it without the travel, but obviously the in-person one, we can do a lot more role plays, and the
right.
experiential piece is a little more intense. So it's just a different modality, different way of doing it. But yeah, I'm definitely doing another one. It was just so great. I'll tell you, the educators were coming in after 2 years and they still were ready to absorb and they're still ready to go at it. So I just want to give a applause to everyone that was really working in the field of education. And you had probably your own kids, biological kids home,
Right,
or your other kids you have at home teaching them. Then you had to teach all the other kids, and then or maybe make sure they got meals. And oh my
right.
gosh, I only heard the half of it. I can't imagine how challenging it was. So
Yeah, it's been a really tough time, I think,
thank you so much. Yes.
for educators for sure. So I want to give people a chance to ask questions in the chat, and I've got more questions for you. But I did want to just mention here real quickly. Let's see where we have people from. We've got Michelle was joining us from Nebraska. Had Donna here from Ohio. Chantel, who happens to be in Virginia but is from New Brunswick, Canada, and is actually a volunteer with our organization as well. Somebody else here from Ohio. So number of people joining from different places. I did have a question here. Let's see. Michelle asked, do behaviorists stop at the behavior, or do they use this new brain science in their treatments? So, I think what Michelle's probably getting at, and, I think we're seeing, so I'm interested in your perspective. I think we're seeing some interesting evolution and shifts happening here. But in my experience and opinion, there's a lot of what I would call classical behaviorism that still happens in our schools. So
Mhm.
back from the 1930s and 50s, operant conditioning, reward and consequence,
Mhm.
and those models are still very pervasive in the schools. I would say that, and probably not just my opinion, but that we're probably 20 years behind in some of these areas in terms of education. It's great to see the trauma informed piece coming in. It's great to see the brain science, but there's still a lot of behaviorism that is not taking all these things into account. Are you seeing that change? Are you working with, and you obviously work with teachers and educators, but are you working with more behavioral folks? Are you seeing people begin to bring in some of the newer brain science, some of the neuroscience that we began benefiting from?
It's a wide spectrum on that. Like you said, there are some districts I talk to people and they're like, they've never even heard the term trauma informed.
Oh
And
gosh,
I'm
right.
like, wow. And then others that are just pioneers and, making changes. I actually was working with a behavioralist, and she was working with the ABA model. And for some kids, that's really what they need. But she was integrating relationship with it as well. So
Right.
it's not that we just throw out that, because some children, they need ABA. That's just where they are. but you can add in the sort of the compassion and the understanding and the connection along with it. So yeah, I just want to make sure we know that it's not just, throw all that out, we've got something new. No, it's using what we already have, what does work, and then adding to it. But I think it's a harder jump for the behavioralist because that's where you're trained.
Right,
It's
right,
just so opposite. It's that 180-degree shift. So I
yeah,
am hopeful because I keep seeing more and more districts being able to say, okay, what we're doing is not working. It's just not working. We're realizing it's not working, which then sometimes it has to get to that crisis point when you're really ready to look at something different. And I think with this, like you said, with the pandemic, we're getting to that point where now I think there's going to be a much bigger shift. So I'm very hopeful of that.
yeah, yeah. No, I would agree. It's interesting. You mentioned the ABA example, and we've got a lot of autistic self advocates that are part of our community,
Mhm.
and I several years ago, didn't really know a whole lot about ABA. And we did not do ABA with my son, not because at the point of time that I had some reason that I was objected to it, but at the time it was recommended. They said, well, he's probably too old for that. And we just kind of went on. But when I got involved in this work, a lot of our work evolves around kind of the idea of, moving beyond kind of compliance-based approaches into compassion, connection, all these things that we can do. I learned a tremendous amount from the members of our community, from the autistic self-advocacy
Mhm.
networks and people that were just what they would say are survivors of things like ABA. And there's some dialogue out there that, if you haven't explored, that's really interesting and really growing. There's a lot of individuals that have been through ABA that have been traumatized by it.
Yeah.
And, of course, ABA has a long history, and some of it was pretty bad. I mean, the fact that there are still schools out there that use aversives, even though ABA as a whole would say, well, we don't do that anymore. There's still schools that, squirt kids with lemon juice and use other things like that. But there is a shift. There is a shift for
Yeah.
sure. And I think to me, it's always important, like, where can we learn from the lived experiences and shift away from things that, even though the intent might be good, if it's something that's not benefiting people, how do we move that? And it's hard. We had there was an event I was at, and we were talking about a lot of issues, and somebody brought up kind of a slide that said something about uncomfortable or unsafe, and kind of the idea being that, during this event you might feel a little uncomfortable. This might challenge some of your thoughts, but be assured you're not going to be unsafe. And how do we move and challenge? But it certainly is always moving. And again, I believe in kind of the raw screen approach when it comes to kids, kind of the idea that kids do well if they can, and also take that over to teachers and staff and all of us. We all do well if we can. And I think the important thing is to learn where we can and grow. And gosh, I look back at some of my early years as a father and think, wow, I could have done better there. But you
Right.
know, being open to it. All right, so we have a question here. How can we build more time to connect with children, especially when co-regulating? That can be a long process. There are so many time constraints.
That's a good question because there are. That's one of the number one questions I get. I don't have time.
Right.
This is a cultural shift. So it's not about, okay, well, I'm going to do 20 minutes of this connection time and fit that in. No, this becomes everything you do. So I don't know if this is in a home environment or a school environment. So I'll just kind of give both examples. But in the home environment, well, parents brush their teeth and so do kids, but we don't usually do it together. Well, then let's brush our teeth together at night, right?
Mhm.
Let's it doesn't anytime there's a chore that has to get done, like, well, that's the child's chore to take out the garbage with them together. So what you're doing is you're doing the normal life things, but you just find ways to do what I call joining and doing things together. If you've got obviously to cook dinner, well, normally I think most parents just cook dinner and say, okay, dinner's ready. I want kids in the kitchen. I want them helping out. And I know what I'm saying. I know, like, the thought bubble a lot of parents have. They're like, I can't get it done if they're in the kitchen. So it just becomes working with it a little bit more and changing the way you do things so that you give a greater opportunity for kids to be able to do things with you. And yeah, sometimes it takes more time for sure. At school, think about where maybe you have a student who really is challenged the minute they get into the classroom. A lot of our students have a hard time transitioning. So
Mhm.
I really advocate is to, if you want that one-on-one time, I mean, you maybe have 30 kids in that class in elementary, or obviously 30 kids every class period if you're middle or high school. But maybe they come in the morning and you give them a job in a way that says, hey, I want to connect with you. How don't you wash on the whiteboard while I'm passing out papers? And you can just get a little conversation in that way. I love having kids eat with their teachers. And I know, again, teachers, sometimes you need that time for self-care. Make sure you have that. But also think about meals. Meals is a family event, and it's not just about eating. It's about learning the conversation, about connecting, learning manners, learning social skills. So the things that we typically say, well, that's what we don't do that together. I want a little more merging around that. And I think that you will find that the time spent doing that
Right.
really sets the stage, so that, let's say that child that comes into your classroom in the morning, they help out with a whiteboard, sharpen pencils, whatever, they're already in the classroom. That way, when the other kids come in, they don't have to make the transition. They've done it already. They're regulated. And then when the other kids come in, they're better. So the investment you make in joining and finding the time, just normal activities you're already going to do, can really pay off.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. We had a interview recently. We were talking to Dr. Kevin Huxhorn, who worked in medical settings, in even acute psychiatric facilities, and was changing the culture. And in fact, did a lot to change the culture to eliminate restraint and seclusion, and to and some of the things that they did are similar to what they talked about having meals
Mhm.
with people that were there, and even reframing the way they looked at people, rather than patients, as almost as guests, almost from a service point of view. And it was really, really interesting. But you're
Nice.
right. I mean, it's these things, and I'm a big believer in like get kids out in nature, like take them for a walk, or
Oh,
get moving, or whatever it may be. And,
yes.
and I would agree with you.
I'm sorry, there's no stress in nature. So when
Yeah.
you look at trying to regulate, that's why nature is so re-regulating for us, because you're in an environment where there's no stress.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it can really make a huge difference, or even just the motion of taking a walk, or, doing something. And like you, I'm kind of like, when I hear that, we don't have time, it's almost the opposite. It's almost, you don't have time not to, right?
I,
Because doing this is going to really improve, everything that you do going forward. So, I want to ask you just a couple more questions, and then we'll wrap things up here. Again, a lot of the things that you talk about, a lot of your work, looking at Help for Billy, and looking at, Classroom 180, of course, you do a lot of focus on educators, but a lot of this is really relevant to, parents as well. And you do a lot of work in that direction. Kind of, again, thinking back to one of the questions I had earlier, that brand new teacher.
yeah.
Unfortunately, so much of this really important information is not making it through our higher education.
Mhm.
So people are not coming out of their programs with a background in brain science or trauma, and the first time they see an Indiana Billy, they don't necessarily know what to expect. So, what is, obviously your training would be a fantastic way for people to learn about, all of this. But what advice do you have for a brand new teacher, or even that seasoned vet that's been doing it for a long time during these difficult times? What advice or critical input would you have for them now?
I think the biggest piece to really consider is the concept of regulation and dysregulation. And I believe that school that said it changed everything, because I know as a parent, I have not been a teacher, but as a parent, when I shifted and said, oh, they're dysregulated, oh, they're in a place of fear, it changed everything about how I interacted with them. I couldn't get mad at them anymore. Like the frustration level was there at some level, but not at this heightened. You just have more patience because you get it. You're like, they're dysregulated, rather than saying, boy, they're so disrespectful. They're
Right.
ruining my class. I put this whole lesson together and they're just ruining it. And so you kind of get out of that, I hate to say the victim mentality, but we get
Mhm.
there
Yep.
because we
Yep.
do things to try to make it great. And then this kid just sabotages it all. So it's very, very easy to slip into that, just not even knowing. So I think that the educational piece, and I've got a lot of stuff on my website just free articles to read. I think the Help for Billy book is a great place to start. But if there's no fun, just go find information. There's so much content out there. Check my website. I've got a whole place of just free resources, free articles I've written. I think that's the place. It starts right here. I guess that's my answer to that. It really starts right here in your ability to see things differently. And then you have the ability to go, okay, now I get it. Because if you're asking the question, how do I change this behavior? You're going to be asking the wrong question, which means you're going to get the wrong answer. And that's where that frustration comes from. So you have to start in your mind, start asking the new question. All right, where is this being driven from? Where can I build relationships? So it's all about changing what's in your mind. And that's going to empower you to really start enjoying that job again, or at least not feel like I picked the wrong profession. If you're a first-year teacher and you're coming into this and you're looking at it from a behavioral perspective, you are within a couple of weeks ready to quit. It's just the wrong perspective. That's all it is, just asking the wrong question.
Yeah, I was thinking again about Sorch Anchor, and he says something to the effect of, seeing a child differently, you see a different child, right?
Yes.
So when you look differently, or even thinking about, the recent book from Dr. Perry, kind of what happened to you, when you begin to look at kids not as what's wrong with you, but understanding that kids have had things that have happened to them, that they're coming in with trauma, they're coming in with experiences, and shifting that lens to a more, but it's difficult. It's difficult. We as people tend to take things personally sometimes, right? We also, I think, tend to think of children as being miniature adults. And of course, what do we know about the brain? It's not fully developed until our mid 20s to 30. There's certainly changes as adults that we have to make to be able to make space to see this differently, and that can make such a huge difference.
And I think that it's like someone said, it's a co-regulation model, meaning you have to be regulated. And that's the hard part, to say to someone, well, just stay calm. Well, it's not possible sometimes. These kids will push every single button, and they are challenging. There's no doubt about it. And to get through that, though, it really is, like I said, is changing your perspective. Because if you have that perspective, the knowing and the science, then you just have a broader perspective. Your heart gets bigger. You don't run into this trying to fix something. You go into it with a sense of allowing, the sense of love, the sense of patience that just is from your wisdom, not from any strategy that you're trying to implement.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, as I said at the beginning, I love the name of your organization, Beyond Consequences. I think it's time to move beyond consequences and compliance and all those different approaches that are out there that unfortunately are not helping kids, and looking at ways that we can connect. Yeah, absolutely. Well, listen, this has been really fantastic. Really appreciate you joining us today and sharing your experience and talking about the work that you're doing. I put links in the chat as we've gone about Classrooms 180, as well as your website, so people will be able to find you. Do you have any final words for people that might be watching before we wrap up?
I think I'll end where I started, with about the whole concept of fear. If you can't remember anything else from this conversation, just remember to look for the fear. Just look for the fear. And when you can do that, then you can find a way to connect with the heart. And that's really the sort of the golden ticket I'll leave you with.
Yeah, and that just makes me think about, kind of the from the medical field, kind of the do no harm. Think about the fear, and also make sure that you don't do anything to contribute to it. What can you do to help address? I'm going to share real quickly before I let you off here about our next program, and I'll keep you here just because I think it'd be good to keep you here for this. And we're going to wrap up in just a second. But we do these every 2 weeks, and our next guest is someone that Jim Sporletter, and I understand that you also authored a book together.
Yeah,
and I was just looking. Trauma-informed school, was that it? The step-by-step implementation.
Yep.
Okay, so I'll put that in the chat as well. Of course, Jim was featured in the film Paper Tigers. Has done a lot of work around trauma-informed schools as well. So we're really excited to have him joining us next time, and really glad that everybody was able to join us today. Heather, appreciate so much you making some time in your schedule. I know you're really busy. You're off later this week to go to an event, right?
Yes, I am.
Yeah.
Speaking of
Okay.
Indianapolis. So.
Okay, great, great. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to say goodbye to everybody. If you hang around for 1 second, and then I'll let you go. So thank you.